Given that we've just seen how motor representations have a role that overlaps with that of intention, insofar as motor representations can ground the directedness of instrumental actions to outcomes, it may be tempting to think of motor representation as just a kind of intention. Doing that would be advantageous theoretically because it would simplify our lives theoretically. But there are some considerations, I think decisive, against equating intention with motor representation. And in this section I want to share those considerations with you. In order to introduce those questions, I need to start by distinguishing two aspects of representation: content and format. So here you have a difference in content. The lines on these two maps represent different routes from where you are to the station. So you go to a stranger and you say to the stranger, "How do I get to the station?" The Gare du Nord, and the stranger gives you one route or gives you another route. There's also, though, the possibility of a difference in representational format. So these two representations differ in content, but they have the same cartographic content. You may be given the same route, though, in a non-cartographic format. Somebody may give you a series of verbal descriptions. We probably call that a propositional format. Call it propositional if you like. I don't want to insist on that. So what's striking about this is that you can have a difference in representational format that is orthogonal to a difference in content. It's also important to notice here that the content format distinction is different again from what people sometimes talk about when they say representational medium. In all of these cases, the media of representation may be paper. They may be all inscribed on paper, same medium throughout, but nevertheless different in both format and content. So I'm going to take for granted that we have a basic understanding of the idea of a difference in format because we are used to using cartographic versus propositional representations, artifactual representations in everyday life. And of course there are other examples of difference of format that you can think about. Now the difference in representational format matters because where there is a difference in representational format, there is a barrier to inferential integration. There is a barrier to inferential integration. And you can see that by imagining the following situation. You have, on the one hand, a verbal description of a route, and on the other hand, a cartographic representation of a route. And someone says to you, are those two descriptions of the same route, or are they of different routes? Now, often enough, if the representations were in the same format, it would be straightforward to answer that question, and you would not have to do any process of translation and comparing them. By contrast, supposing that you're not allowed to actually walk the routes or imagine walking the routes, then you are going to, in one way or another, have to translate between the propositional and the cartographic in order to answer the question, are these two routes identical? This is illustration of the idea that where there's a difference in format, there is a barrier to inferential integration. Saying whether two things are the same or different, for example, requires some kind of translation unless you're able to walk or imagine walking the routes. Now you want to know, well, how is it that you can distinguish between representational formats? Now when we're talking about artifacts, we're talking about literally bits of paper. Distinguishing formats is, I suppose, relatively straightforward. But I'm about to tell you that we're going to use the notion of representational format in thinking also about mental representations, not just artifactual ones. So it would be good if we have a way of distinguishing formats that applies across all of them. One way to do this is to think about the characteristic performance profiles. So imagine that we're in the situation, I'm there in the room with several people, and each of them has a representation of a route. And I don't know for each person whether that representation is cartographic or propositional. And my task is to try, without looking at their representations or asking them directly to try to work out what format their representation is in. Now, one way I could do that is by looking at the characteristic performance profile that they exhibit. I might ask them, for example, could you identify key landmarks on the route? I would expect that the propositional users will be relatively fast, whereas the cartographic users will be relatively slow. Not that there won't be exceptions to that, but that will be a kind of clue about how to do this. Conversely, I might say to them, could you translate that route into a series of compass headings, right? Give me the bearings that you need to follow at each stage in the route. And there, I think if you've got the cartographic route, you're probably going to be very fast, whereas on the whole, with a propositional representation, you're going to be relatively slow. So I'm not saying that the characteristic performance profiles allow me in absolutely every case, without ever being misled, to distinguish correctly which is the cartographic and which is the propositional representation. But I'm saying that in general, we can know and discriminate representational formats by appeal to characteristic performance profiles in this way. The same principle, we can distinguish representational formats by distinguishing characteristic performance profiles, can be applied to mental representations. So to illustrate, let's start by trying to establish a common format. There is a way of imagining seeing things which is phenomenologically somewhat like actually seeing things. And we can show that there is a commonality in representational format here by noting some interesting things related to the performance profiles of activities involved imagining seeing. So for example, how much of an object you can imagine seeing depends on its size and its distance from you in just the same way that actually seeing does. Furthermore, how long it takes you to look over an object depends on just the factors that would, in imagination, how long it takes you to imagine looking over the object when you're imagining seeing it in this immersive way is determined by just the factors which are determining how long it takes you to actually look over an object. So there is a interesting, curious commonality of performance profile here, which is naturally explained by the conjecture that imagining seeing involves representations of the same format that are involved in actually seeing. Now, something similar is true in the case of imagining acting. There is a kind of imagining acting which is phenomenologically much like actually acting, where you're really putting yourself in the situation and trying to work through the actions without yet actually performing them. And interestingly, this has proved to be important in a practical sense because some of the research on imagining acting has fed its way into literature on expertise in sports. In any case, we know also that there is a commonality of performance profile between actually acting and merely imagining acting in this really action-like way. So, for example, how long it takes you to imagine moving an object is related to how long it would actually take for you to move that object. Also, factors that make it more difficult to actually pick up an object, for example, turning the handle of a mug away from you makes it harder for you to pick up the object. They also make it harder for you to imagine picking up the object as well. So the commonality of performance profiles, again, has been used by researchers who discovered these to argue that there is a common representational format which is involved both in actually acting and also in imagining acting. But what interests us is not just commonality of representational format, but distinction of representational formats. And what I've been saying already implies that there is very likely a distinction in the representational format involved in imagining seeing versus the representational format in imagining acting. To see that, you have to distinguish between two situations. Imagine on the one hand seeing a ball rotating, and on the other hand imagine rotating the ball yourself. What we would expect based on the research is that what constrains how fast the ball can move when you're imagining seeing is how difficult it would be to perceive the features of the ball as it moves. If it moves super fast, it's no longer highly visible to you. On the other hand, in the case of imagining rotating the ball yourself, you're imagining acting, we would expect the imagination to be constrained by the kind of factors that constrain actually moving the ball, such as the difficulty of holding the ball. If we make the ball slippier, the thing should become slower and more effortful. That difference in performance profile is an indication that the representations involved in imagining seeing differ with respect to format from the representations involved in imagining acting. So far so good, very simple. Now, you might say, Steve, the distinction here is not due, the distinction in performance profiles is not really due to a difference in format, it's due to a difference in content. In one case, you're imagining something moving, and in the other case, you're imagining moving it. So there is a difference in content, and that's true. So this is actually a good objection. Whenever we've got a difference in performance profiles, we want to attribute that to a difference in representational format. It's always a good objection to say, well, look, there's this other factor. There's this other factor which may explain the difference in performance profiles that isn't representational format. And insofar as we don't want to multiply representational formats unnecessarily, that's a good objection. But I know that the objection is wrong because Fiori and colleagues did a very interesting experiment back in 2013. Here's the background to their experiment. Two tasks involve identifying the orientation of a letter. So for example, you might be able to tell me that this is a letter J as opposed to one which is the mirror image of a letter J, right? And I could give you lots of simile, and your task would be in each case to say, look, it's a J, it's a J, it's a mirror J, it's a mirror J, J, and so on. Alternatively, I might ask you to say something about the handedness of this hand, right? So is this a left hand or is this a right hand? I might ask you. Now, interestingly, when people do this, it's likely that they do, in this case, they imagine seeing the object rotate, and in this case, they imagine rotating the hand, right? So the difference between imagining seeing and imagining acting seems to correspond to these two cases, because here people seem to be imagine seeing the letter rotate, and here they seem to be imagine moving the hand rotating. And we know that because which rotations are difficult in the hand case depend on biomechanical constraints, whereas there are no biomechanical constraints involved in the J case. Right? So putting your hand into this position is not terribly awkward, but it's a bit awkward. Putting it to this position is much easier. Right? So the more awkward the position that you have to get into in order to imagine moving the hand, the more awkward it is to imagine moving the hand, and so the slower you are to identify whether it's a left hand or a right hand. What a brilliant result, by the way. So that's background. Imagine seeing it rotate, imagine rotating it. That's generally how you are likely to solve the experiment. We know that because in this case the biomechanical awkwardness of the rotation matters, but of course the corresponding difference is nothing in that case. There's no evidence of it at all. Very nice experiment. Now you might say here, well, Steve, we have got a difference in performance profiles, but that's explained by the difference in content. What you're imagining in this case is moving the hand, and what you're imagining in that case is seeing the letter move. I agree, there is a difference in content, but here's the really cool thing. Fiori and colleagues studied a group of patients with something called amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, which is essentially damage to the motor system for our purposes. So these patients with their damaged motor systems were unable to imagine acting because of damage to the motor representation by hypothesis. And interestingly, their performance on this task showed no difference between the hand rotation and the letter rotation. So your typical neurotypical subjects will show a difference between the awkward versus non-awkward hands that doesn't correspond to any difference in the J letter. And that difference is abolished in the amyotrophic lateral sclerosis patients. Now, if the difference between the two tasks were explained just by the difference in content. In one case I'm imagining moving the hand, and in the other case I'm imagining seeing the letter move, but there's no difference in representational format. Then there should be no difference between the neurotypical control subjects and the amniotropic lateral sclerosis patients. But in fact there is, and that tells us that we cannot explain the difference in performance profile just by appeal to the content of the imagination, but must instead appeal to the notion of representational format. Very good. So far, what I've been arguing isn't the thing that I most directly want. What I've been arguing is that we can use differences in characteristic performance profile to distinguish between the representational formats of mental states, such as those involved in imagining seeing something move versus those involved in imagining moving it. Now what I want to do is to apply that to the difference between two ways of imagining an action. So far we were focusing on the kind of action imagination that you do when you're kind of putting yourself in the position, and it's almost like you're kind of acting but you're just not moving your body, right? But you want to get as close as possible. But of course there's also a more cognitive form of imagination, which in a sense I might say to you, imagine playing piano concerto in the Royal Albert Hall, and you, like me, not being able to play piano at all, perhaps, okay, and if you can play piano, different instrument, you can imagine, right, it in a sort of cognitive sense, but you can't put yourself bodily into that action. You can't put yourself bodily into that action in the way that the skilled, expert pianist can. So there we are, and I say to you, I'm going to take two people, right? I'm going to take a professional basketball player in this case, because I've got some quite good evidence about basketball players. On the other hand, I'm going to take someone who's never played basketball in their lives at all, but has written plenty about it, so knows plenty about it. And in both cases, I ask them to imagine performing a basketball shot. What I would expect is that the professional basketball player with the skills will be able to do this by using the immersive form of action imagination, the kind that's phenomenologically just like really acting, and so that their actions will be very much constrained by the distance between them and the ball, the mass of the ball, and so on. So if they make the ball heavier, the whole thing will become much harder. The imaginative activity will become much harder with this unusually heavy ball, and so on. By contrast, the person who is using the more cognitive form of imagination will not be subject to those constraints. It's no harder to think about throwing a heavy ball through a hoop than a light ball through a hoop. So once again, we've got a difference here in performance profile between a cognitive form of imagining acting, thinking about what you might do, and a more immersive form of imagining acting, imaginatively putting yourself in that situation and imaginatively performing the actions. That difference in performance profile tells us that the representational formats are different. Since the representational formats are involved in the cognitive form of imagination, I'm going to give the label propositional to, whatever that amounts to. I'm agnostic about what that amounts to. It follows that motor representations, since they differ in representational format from those, are not propositional attitudes. Steve, why are we suddenly talking about motor representations? That's because I suppose that the representations involved in imagining acting are indeed the motor representations. And there's some quite good evidence for this, which is very much like the evidence we considered when we were looking at the double life of motor representations. If you ask people to imagine acting and temporarily impair their ability to represent actions motorically, their ability to imagine acting in the immersive action-like sense is impaired or even destroyed. Conversely, when you enhance people's skills motorically, you have a corresponding effect on their ability to imagine acting. So the representations involved in imagining acting differ in representational format from the propositional kind involved in the sort of more cognitive form of imagining doing something, A, and are, B, motor representations. And that's why I know that no motor representations are propositional attitudes. But now you might think, well, maybe there are some intentions, Steve, which are not propositional attitudes. Good, I'm glad you had that thought. I think that can't be right. First of all, I think that you only get seamless inferential integration when you have representations with a common format. That's my first premise. Secondly, I think it's kind of an axiom about intentions that any two of them can be inferentially integrated in practical reasoning. So it's not that you can rationally have a bunch of intentions over here and rationally have a bunch of intentions over there, but it's just kind of no way that we could expect them even in optimal, cognitively optimal conditions to sort of somehow feature together in a single piece of practical reasoning. I think that's wrong. There must be always the possibility, at least in ideal circumstances, of inferential integration. I also know that there are propositional intentions. In particular, my intention that I visit the Centre for Interdisciplinary Studies, well, that's a propositional attitude. It follows from that that all intentions are propositional attitudes. And now I've got what I wanted. No motor representations, but all intentions are propositional attitudes. Therefore, they differ in format, in representational format. Therefore, no motor representations are intentions, and that was the very thing to be argued.